Whether you call it land art or earth art, or just refer to the stuff as earthworks, the group of artists interested in manipulating land shared a lot of interests with the minimalists and process artists. Overall, the land artists cared about the literalness, the physicality of their materials. For example, its weight and durability, its response to gravity and erosion. But then they also showed a tendency to look back toward Barnett Newman's sublime. And they revealed a tendency to look forward toward what, in our next module, we will call institutional critique. Those two tendencies, the sublime and the critical, combine in Michael Heiser's Double Negative from 1969 to 70, which you see here. For the piece, Heiser, who came from a family of geologists, found a spot on the edge of a canyon in a remote area of Nevada desert and carved and dumped away some 240,000 tons of rock. From the air, the cuts he made look like two minus signs across from each other. Whether or not two negatives make a positive, I don't know, but they do line up, suggesting a continuity through the air, a kind of axis of power, reminiscent of the zips of Barnett Newman. What Heiser and Newman have in common is the experience of the void that focuses the mind on big issues of existence, rather than the trivialities of things like consumer capitalism. As Heiser put it, quote, "In the desert, I can find that kind of unraped, peaceful, religious space artists always tried to put in their work," unquote. You'll remember how Newman said that, quote, "If my work were properly understood, it would be the end of state capitalism and totalitarianism," unquote. In her important book, Passages in Modern Sculpture, the art historian Rosalind Krauss argued much this point when she observes how the visitor to Double Negative can never really occupy the piece. Instead, he or she stands in one side and looks out over to the other. This can't help but remind the viewer of how he or she looks, how insignificant he or she looks from a distance in the midst of a trench that's 40 feet deep and on the other side of a canyon. By being located in the middle of nowhere, Heiser's piece brings art out of the gallery, too. It critiques the idea of the museum and of the gallery as possessors and presenters of art. Heiser was very lucky to have Virginia Dwan as his gallerist, a kind of gallerist that really doesn't exist anymore. The wealthy patron who throws her money behind art, which she believes in, without much caring about financial gain. Her gallery, the Dwan Gallery, only lasted a few years. But back to the basics again. We can see that the way rock has poured into the canyon, and in this recent photo, how the excavated trenches have worn away, almost looking natural, speak to the issues familiar from minimalism and especially process art. Maybe the most interesting of the land artists was Robert Smithson. Following the process artists, he explored the nature of materials and the force of gravity in works like Glue Pour from 1969, which you see here, and Asphalt Rundown from the same year. Early on, he had become fascinated with crystals in works like this untitled one from 1963-64. He liked crystals, not least of all because of the way that crystals grow, according to mathematical sequences of the sort that fascinated the minimalists. And he explored that principle here in Leaning Strata from 1968. Crystals also offered a connection to nature that didn't measure time in lifetimes, but in eons of time, vast stretches that reached into the distant past and also into the distant future. Smithson was a New Jersey boy who often came into the city to visit the museum, not the Museum of Modern Art or the Met, but the American Museum of Natural History. The dioramas he saw there of animals in specific locales apparently intrigued him and influenced one of his key ideas, that of the site and the non-site. And this was long before he read something by the sculptor Tony Smith that helped him distill and clarify the idea of the site and non-site. What is a site but a real place that's always changing because it's exposed to real-life forces like wind, rain, etc. A non-site is a reference to that real place, a kind of indexical sign, such as a diorama. The problem is that that sign stays the same, so that its accuracy in representing the site is continuously eroding. With this 1920s era diorama that you see of two jaguars in the Guaymas Valley in Sonora, Mexico, maybe my all-time favorite diorama at the museum. Who knows how the valley looks today? Maybe there's a strip mall down there, a Motel 6, and a Burger King. Smithson's non-site, Franklin, New Jersey, from 1968, presents this problem. A topographical map refers to the terrain of Franklin when the map was made. Rocks from Franklin lie in bins on the floor that mirror the shape of the map fragments. They mirror rather than replicate because they cannot really relate to the map. In fact, the 5 trapezoidal-shaped bins don't actually relate to the same parts of the map. The system of signs breaks down into 2 systems, both of which have a decreasing relation to the actual site, because they, in the museum, stay the same. At the American Museum of Natural History, another particular exhibit that fascinated Smithson was the Felix Warburg Hall of Man and Nature. It provided an in-depth look at the ecology of the New York region, and it opened in 1952 when Smithson was 14. Here's a photo of a part of the exhibit that explores how our region looked in the time of the dinosaurs. It features a diorama that you could never mistake for an actual view into a place, for an illusion, the way you could with the jaguars, because it's small, and because it's actually a reflection that you see on a tilted mirror, a little like some early TV sets from the late 40s and early 50s. It makes the dinosaurs feel far away. It seems fairly likely that these mirrors at the museum influenced pieces like Smithson's Incidents of Mirror Displacement from 1969. These photos he took of mirrors arranged in a variety of places in the Yucatan suggested how the mirror image of things represents a thing, but in a manner that is not quite equivalent to the thing itself. It's opposite from it. It's a mirror reflection. Mirrors happen to look like crystals. They're crystalline, they're shiny, but they, of course, are not crystals. All glass is, in fact, a liquid, a very slowly dripping and pouring liquid, which will have ripple patterns if you let it sit long and long enough, hundreds of years. In a way, a mirror is a displacement of the idea of a crystal, in the same way that a mirror reflection is a displacement of the thing that it reflects. So it's a pretty clever metaphor. Mirrors can also function in terms of institutional critique. If you're in the site, or the non-site, as you see in Corner Mirror with Carl from 1969, the mirror reflects the place you're in and draws attention to where you are. Especially with this piece, you see Smithson's institutional critique because it draws attention to museums as artificial and, in a way, as dead environments. It's a point he made obvious in this drawing, Museum of the Void, from 1969. Smithson's most famous piece is Spiral Jetty from 1970. It's a 1,500-foot long, 15-foot wide jetty that extends from Roselle Point, Utah, into the Great Salt Lake. Roselle Point is remote, and very few people have actually seen this famous piece in person. The spiral is a resonant shape for Smithson that relates to the long history of the Great Salt Lake. The spiral relates to myths that settlers on their way west had about the lake, that its saltiness came from the Pacific, and whirlpools there could suck you underground all the way to the ocean. The spiral goes further back, as Smithson explained in a mystical film he made about the project, which certainly explores the idea of the sublime. Here are his own words. Quote, "Following the spiral steps, we return to our origins, back to some pulpy protoplasm. My eyes become combustion chambers. The sun vomited its corpuscular radiations." Unquote. Smithson here sounds almost as disgusting as Georges Bataille, the surrealist of baseness. But he also suggests that the sun is a spiral, which is how ancient peoples of the West depicted it in the drawings on the faces of stones. In his film, Smithson also speaks about dinosaurs here long ago and compares them to the big monsters of machines that he shows making his spiral jetty. He also compares the bones of dinosaurs to the bones of rusted machinery he found on shore, where there had been an abandoned oil rig. By focusing on industrial decay, Smithson certainly distinguished himself from the minimalists, who loved the precision and impersonality of machinery. Decay was a big part of Smithson's work. He called it entropy and related it to the process of time on a site. A few years after Smithson finished Spiral Jetty, the waters of the lake rose, and they've covered it for most of the years since then. Almost 40 years later, the Dia Foundation bought Roselle Point and have restored Spiral Jetty. I can't help but believe that Smithson, who died in a plane crash in 1973 while working on another piece, would be horrified at such an effort to strip away the effects of entropy, of time. One last artist I want to mention is the minimalist/earth artist Walter de Maria. De Maria is famous for two pieces in New York that are owned and presented in Soho by the same Dia Foundation. Broken Kilometer from 1979, in which the artist laid out 500 round, polished, 2-meter-long, solid brass pipes in a loft you can visit at 393 West Broadway, and the New York Earth Room from 1977, in which 280,000 pounds of dirt fills another publicly accessible loft to a height of 22 inches. And you can visit that one at 141 Worcester Street. Outside of New York, you can find his lightning field near Quemado, New Mexico, which was created between 1971 and 77 and is also owned by the Dia Foundation. It's comprised of 400 stainless steel poles, 220 feet apart, in a space that's 1 mile by 1 kilometer in size. The poles are over a field that's all terminate at the same height. They all make an imaginary surface about 20 feet above the ground. If you visit, I would urge you not to wander among these poles during an electrical storm. In any case, there's no question that it participates in what can only be called a sublime landscape. Yet, with its regular pattern imposed on the landscape, something that's so redolent of minimalism, the piece suggests to me a kind of harnessing or controlling of nature. It's as if it were a lightning farm. And in this way, it's less poetic and evocative, I feel, than Robert Smithson's work.